Good evening and a very warm welcome to this very special event organized by the Observer Research Foundation with, of course, HarperCollins for the launch of a very special book titled The Ultimate Goal, a former R&AW chief deconstructs how nations construct narratives. The author, Mr. Vikram Sood, is with us this evening, and a star-packed panel is going to discuss the book and indeed is going to discuss the narratives industry. We have Minister Smriti Irani, who's joined us. We have Mr. Baijayant Panda, National Vice President of the Bharatiya Janata Party, Mr. Sunjoy Joshi, Chairman of the Observer Research Foundation, and Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal will be joining us in a bit, and we will be interrogating the nation's ability to tell stories about itself, and of course implicit in it will be India's attempts to craft an India story in the past and in the future. But before I do that, let me invite our partner Swati Chopra, Executive Editor of HarperCollins, to deliver the welcome remarks. Swati.
Thank you, Samir. Delighted to be here this evening to welcome our esteemed panelists and our audience to the launch of The Ultimate Goal on behalf of HarperCollins India. To very briefly introduce the book, The Ultimate Goal, a former R&AW chief deconstructs how nations construct narratives. According to Mr. Sood, the ultimate goal of nations is to construct narratives favorable to them. A country's ability to construct, sustain, and control narratives at home and abroad enhances its strength and position. Intelligence agencies invariably play a critical role in this and often indispensable tool of statecraft. A narrative may not necessarily be based on truth, but it does need to be plausible, have a meaning, and create a desired perception. During most of the 20th century, intelligence agencies helped shape narratives favorable to their country's agendas through avenues as diverse as literature, history, drama, art, music, and cinema. Today, social media has become crucial to manipulating, countering, or disrupting narratives with its ability to spread fake news, disinformation, and provoke reactions. As Mr. Sood says in the book, and I quote, "If a major power with global interests wishes to retain its supremacy or prevent alternative centers of power from emerging, it naturally must be able to tell its story, tell it first, tell it well, and repeatedly, in different ways and at different times. Creating narratives and favorable perceptions does not happen by accident. There must be an agenda to do so and must be worked at over time." End quote. So that is just a very brief introduction of the book. Over to you, Samir.
Thank you very much, Swati. Since we are not meeting in person, the closest approximation for a book release would be to request the minister to raise the book for the camera as a mark of release of the formal release of the book written by Mr. Vikram Sood. So, Madam Minister, we look forward to your holding up the book. And I guess this means that please start ordering it online, going to the bookstores and picking it up and sending in your comments and critique online and in person and through emails and other routes. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us this evening. Let me congratulate the author, Mr. Sood, by way of some personal musings. He's someone who's been a mentor and advisor to many of us at ORF. He is someone who is gentle in his mannerisms, but very, very determined and very tough in his both determination in strengthening India as well as in handling some of the challenges that the country faces. He has guided our neighborhood program specifically for many, many years, and as the advisor at ORF, he is like our he's like the institutional memory and the institutional compass in many of the projects that we run. So, Mr. Sood, a warm congratulations from all of us at ORF. You are family, and we would love to hear from you on this particular work of yours. You have the mic, sir. And thereafter we will begin the panel discussion. So, Mr. Sood, over to you.
Thank you very much, Samir, for your very generous comments. Before I begin my little talk, I wish to once again thank the panelists who have joined us today, who've done me the honor, and done ORF the honor for joining us. I would especially thank Smriti Irani for this, because she was not She's not well, she's not good in health today. I thank you, Mr. Panda, also for joining me, and Mr. Joshi, and Mr. Sanyal will join us later. Actually, I've been in ORF for 15 years now, and it's second home to me. And throughout this period, I've felt as if I belonged there. And it started off on a very modest footing many years ago, but it was the dynamism of Samir, Saran, and the sagacity of Sunjoy Joshi that has brought this organization to an international acclaim. It is your efforts, Samir, and your efforts, Sanjay, and full credit goes to your team. I also want to thank Swati Chopra, the executive editor, for a charming, cheerful encouragement all along as I was doing the book, and her team in HarperCollins. And of course the ORF team, which has organized this event for me. Now to get back to the book. When I was young, and that was quite a long time ago, there was only one narrative really that we heard, All India Radio. There were 3 or maybe 4 newspapers, but at home we knew only one, The Statesman. It was not considered necessary to subscribe to more than one. Besides, The Statesman was the only paper that wrote good English, father would say. And we left it at that. Well, all newspapers carried really the same news, which is way, way different from what is happening nowadays. Doordarshan then was in infancy when the India-China war happened in 1962. BBC was always the favored destination for news. It was the go-to news station. So it was anti-BBC was truthful, fair, and honest. That's what they said of themselves, and that's what we believed. They being our former colonial masters. So, but whenever we got to see later the Western version of ourselves in their magazines, newspapers, journals, or on TV much later, news about India had the same stock shots. A beggar, a snake charmer, cattle on the streets, with the caption, Hindus worship the cow. Poverty and Taj Mahal. So they first impoverished us, and then they blamed us for being poor. Whatever we did later to improve our lot, this narrative did not change. The commentary would be about corruption, inefficiencies, mismanagement under socialism. Some of us fretted, others shrugged and moved on. At home we were told, get a job and get a life. The story is essentially the same for most of us. Democracy is actually a very fine invention. One person, one vote in one country, and ballot box is king. But the principle never applied to international governance, where sovereignty was somewhat equal, but power was not. Those who did not distinguish suffered. International order was maintained by the chosen powerful few. Nationalism was good if it was Western, but undesirable when it came to colonies or former colonies. Indian nationalism had been reduced to, in this narrative, to Hindu majoritarian nationalism. So if there is ideology, it is my ideology. If there is idealism, it is my idealism. And throughout my career, I saw how nations spun their stories and how these became the perceived or accepted truth. My book is actually a narrative about narratives. Narratives that are hidden at times and obvious at other times. The book is not a critique or a complaint about the ways of the West, but really an explanation. And the book is based on essentially Western sources. I believe there's no point in whining. Change the narrative if you can, or accept it if you must. Therefore, the book is a powerful account about how powerful nations, it's a factual account, sorry, about powerful nations who go about their business of constructing their narratives, their storylines of past grandeur and present nobility of purpose to control and to dominate. I explained that narratives are not necessarily based on truth. I think Swati has mentioned it too. But they are more about perceptions that they create. The long-term portrayal of a virtuous, noble dispensation which is good for mankind. That it is also for profits and domination is never mentioned. There is deception and ambiguity too, a mixture of fact and fiction. Narratives have naturally been written by the rich and powerful, and by the victorious after wars have been won. We know that through history. Powerful democracies like in the US are run by power elites, the wealthy elites. I believe 11% of US own 89% of the wealth, and the rest is owned by the poor, 80%. The corporate media heads up parts of the power structure. 6 US media giants control 90% of what is seen and read and watched by you and I. So are powerful think tanks who also cater to the needs of the military, industrial, technological, intelligence complex. Together they control the media waves, radio stations, news agencies, TV channels, and now the social media. Economic prosperity also does immense concentration of wealth, exists also in the hands of the wealthy. It is also assumed that cultural superiority is the tipping edge of making Western approaches acceptable to the people, right from Pierre's soap to the classics. At a time when we listened to Pat Boone and Elvis Presley in the 60s, they never listened to Mohammad Rafi or Lata Mangeshkar. It was Shakespeare in my school, but not Kalidas and theirs, and so on. Their word and their opinion became gospel in every aspect, including what happens in other countries. The Cold War was won by the Allies for a number of reasons. One of them being the Cold Wars launched by the CIA and other agencies. Multi-million-dollar, multifaceted CIA campaigns kept communism away from Western UP. Actually, you can't keep intelligence agencies out of any game of power play, which is just as well. We enjoy that. As for India, I argue that we must project our own narrative ourselves, in our words, and not repeat what comes to us from the rest of the world. We must stop taking umbrage at everything that is thrown at us, while at the same time seeking approbation from the same sources. There are biases, and that is the reality. It is far better to create our own narrative, because the country is not gifted greatness by others. We have to work for it. Narratives are not drawn in the rooms of bureaucrats in the North or South Bloc. They are combined, sustained efforts at the national level. Learning to take pride in our past, it is good to know that our heritage is longer than our recent history. Let us also remember that we cannot let the past be a millstone, and that rivers do not flow backwards. Learn from the past and prepare for the future. So I thought maybe the nation wants to know, and I put my thoughts together. As I said to it, and I have said in my book, the Indian narrative has been run for far too long from elsewhere. It needs to change and cannot be determined in Europe, America, or elsewhere. India and Indians must tell our own story. Western narratives will continue to remain, especially the ones that portray the West's invincibility and superiority. But the day we get our acts together, they will come to us. We need to manage our narrative to control our destiny. We now live in the age of COVID, scrambling powers, and algorithms, so let's get ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sood. I think in your very brief comments, you have touched on a number of important aspects: the ownership of the narrative, the objectives of building narratives, the actors who have been most influential in projecting narratives, and of course, nations that have been able to sustain stories about themselves having prevailed in the recent contemporary experience post the World War. So let me turn from your very insightful comments to Minister Irani, who in many ways understands storytelling and stories better than most of us. She built a whole litany of narratives about the Indian household over many, many years in a different avatar. Ma'am, Mr. Sood suggests that, and implicit in his book, is perhaps a lament that India has not successfully projected a story about itself. It has not been able to build a sustained narrative, that it has been able to script itself. Why is it that the land richest in storytelling still doesn't have a story and a sustainable, attractive story to share with the world?
It's very unusual for a female minister, and that too somebody who has served mostly in the social sector, to have a sounding board in a person who has served in the R&AW as its chief. But I've considered myself extremely privileged to have had the opportunity of engaging with Mr. Sood over a number of years and from benefiting from his advice. If you read the India story, which is a part of this beautiful book, there's a particular anger which is a bit unusual for Vikram Sood, a public angst about how India has been misrepresented over a number of years in terms of its narrative. But if you look at the last line that he likes, and he quotes Milan Kundra, it says, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." And I think that that beautifully surmises the angst that Mr. Sood has pronounced even on this book launch. When you talk, Samir, about whether we have successfully managed to counter a narrative that has been built about a country, we have to be honest that we've not. I think Mr. Sood in his opening remarks speaks about get a life and move on if you cannot change the narrative. And I think over a number of years, people just chose to move on. We knew that stories were built about snake charmers, which was not true to the real self of every Indian, or for that matter, the India that was emerging from the ruins of colonialism. But we were so busy trying to build a nation, possibly, and politically so disinterested in the harm that a destructive narrative brings to an economy, brings to a nation's subconscious, that we did not productively engage and try and create our own narrative. I understand when Mr. Sood says that you don't take umbrage to every falsehood that has been thrust upon your nation's narrative, or a story that has been spun to bring disrepute to your country. But I think that if you look at the past, there's been too much of surrender on account of narrative, rather than building our story. Swati, in her opening remarks, talks about narratives not necessarily dependent on the truth. But I think given the explosion of technology today, nations cannot afford to build narratives based on untruths. Because of the amount of information now available in the public sphere, I think this is the time to constructively build a narrative about a culture, a heritage, a nation which is older than its own democratic existence. I also feel that there's been sustained effort to ensure that we have a negative narrative with regards to our economic potential, with regards to our social fabric, so that it can in some way help sustain a sense of despondency internationally about India. And I feel that at least for the past 6 years under the Prime Minister's leadership, the narrative that is being constructed across the world, including what the Prime Minister today in his interview to Economic Times has said, that when we talk about self-reliance, we are not talking about being a destination because you have no other opportunity to build on your investments, or because we want to be the number 2 for a country that you might be shedding your economic relationships with. We want to be known as a destination where you have ample opportunity on the basis of competence to build your new, possibly financial prospects. So I think that the sustained effort in the past 6 years, which I've been also party to, have seen narratives shift on different issues. The narrative shifts on issues not only which are economic, but when you talk about the social fabric today, narratives are shifting on gender issues. And if you look at the gender issue with regards to India, for too long, we have spoken about suppressed Indian women, and that's become our narrative across the world. For too long, we've talked about Indian women who never had an opportunity to either be educated or be financially empowered. And I think that those are the roadblocks when we try and engage with empirical evidence and with data that are met with a little bit of suspicion. But I think the effort needs to be sustained. The engagement has to be sustained. And as Mr. Sood has rightfully said, you need to have your own narrative of the past, the present, and the future.
Ma'am, let me ask you one more question, and I will ask the same question of Mr. Jay Panda as well, but I want to ask you, because you have been a star campaigner in many political battles, and now you are in government. Do you believe that democracies which are as polarized as the world generally is today, and I'm not saying India is an exception, I'm saying India is perhaps the rule, that we are seeing a polarized democratic landscape, do you believe democratic cycles where political battles play out between sections of the polity tend to undermine the ability of nations to build coherent stories? So do you think the India story is undermined by India's democracy? I'm putting it in a very crude binary way, but
I think that if you flip through the pages of the book and read the, I think, underlining meaning to the narratives that Mr. Sood brings to the fore, one recognizes that any time status quo is challenged, the challenger is known as the instigator, the one who wants to break peace. If you do not come to terms with whatever is being thrust upon you, and if you challenge that particular narrative, then you become a fundamentalist, then you become the Hindu brigade. And I think that is what you're seeing right now, that for too long people, as Mr. Sood said, that there was just the statesman that came home. For too long you were dished out a particular narrative, an opinion, a particular piece of news, which was crafted with a particular kind of a thought process. And if now today you challenge that, you are known as a fundamentalist, you are known as a rabble-rouser, you are known as a troublemaker. So if you talk about true democratic processes where you want citizens to engage on fact, or for that matter, when you want citizens to have the freedom to disagree with each other, given the limitations of law and order, you would want to, I think, reposition your question. Were we okay till we took what was handed to us as a narrative? And do we become the uncomfortable one part of this whole narrative or this whole particular polity that you talk of, just because we want to challenge a particular narrative that was dished out to us? For instance, I think that if I just go by 2-3 instances, the recent reform that was done in the agriculture sector. Now, for too long, people said that this is an impossibility, that there would be a nationwide response as such that the entire rural economy will come to a grinding halt, which did not happen. There was a fear that was instilled in Indians that if Article 370 goes, there will be bloodshed around the country. That did not happen. There was a fear that was established that if the Ram Mandir issue comes to a close through the Supreme Court, there will be parties who will not accept the judgment that is delivered. That has not happened. And I think that the maturity of the Indian democracy is such that yes, we break out in Twitter wars and we agree to disagree with each other, and some say that we are extremely shrill, but at least today there's an equal platform for every voice to be heard. So those who are a bit uncomfortable at the pushback, possibly will say that these rabble-rousers are now breaking down the whole social fabric.
Thank you, ma'am. Let me also at this time ask the audiences to post their questions. We will try to weave their questions into the conversation over the next 30 odd minutes. We have started receiving some, and we welcome more. Mr. Jay Panda, let me turn to you. As a vice president of the world's largest political party, and I hope I'm right in making that assertion, do you believe that as the largest party in this country, the political cycles have not catalyzed, have not incentivized us to build an India story? We are still building the next election story, not necessarily a story for the decades ahead, for a sustained international tale that is attractive, that is appealing, and that is polysemic and universal. That's the first part of my question. The second, I think, when I went through the book, I felt Mr. Sood gave greater agency to the state and lesser agency to the non-state. In the 21st century, I believe many corporations and many individuals are beginning to create stories which are detached from the geography they belong to. And is that a challenge you foresee in the coming days? Because you are someone who's actually worked in the tech sector quite closely. And do you see the narratives emerging from the non-state challenging our geographical orientation around stories? So I want to ask you these two questions, Mr. Panda.
Thank you, Mr. Saran. Let me answer your preliminary question first. Yes, I think it has been publicly announced that I'm Vice President of the BJP. Now, about the other two questions, I think they get to the heart of the matter. And first, let me say that Mr. Vikram Sood has done a brilliant job, first of all, encapsulating narratives, not just the whys, but the hows in the modern era of the past century, starting from British and American and Russian intelligence from early in the 20th century to the roles of different kinds of institutions, including multilateral institutions, some very powerful think tank type of institutions, the role of the intelligence services, of course, even in the recent years and recent decades, leading up to the impact it has had on India and is having on India, about which Minister Smriti Irani ji spoke so eloquently just now. So let me answer your two questions as follows. The narrative settings are not just, I would put it in a tech term, it's not just software that you can keep changing. Some of it is hardwired into our systemic processes. So let me give the example that I believe a lot of the narrative that Mr. Sood has touched upon in the book relating to India emanates or starts from somewhere around 1857, from after the War of Independence. What happened then was the colonial rulers came to the conclusion, A, that it has to be not just divide and rule, but that the largest section of the population had to be somehow alienated so that others couldn't get into it. So from there emanated, for example, a very peculiar definition of secularism as has been applied since then in India, where only Hindu temples are controlled by the government, whereas no other religious places of any other religion are controlled by the government. Now, this is hardwired into our systems, and it sustains till this date of spinning this particularly odd narrative that secularism means you have to be anti-Hindu, because that was done with the colonial objective in mind. Although we got a change of system in 1947 with independence, now, yes, we really did get independence and many things changed. We have proven in the last 70 odd years that we can govern ourselves, contrary to what people like Churchill very loudly used to proclaim. But this continuity of some of the hardwired processes and laws and attitudes have not changed. So thus, the writing of history that took place in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century has continued, and till date you have the bias that I was just mentioning, and which Mr. Sood has referred to in his book, where the new narrative that is succeeding, a narrative of a nation of 1.3 billion people, that we don't have to shun our heritage, we don't have to shun our culture to be seen as civilized, we had civilization thousands of years ago, and we can adapt to a modern version of that. And this is being resisted, as Mr. Sood has pointed out in the book, by the so-called leftist liberals in the country. So that brings us to the point, is the narrative setting only focused on the present or going forward? Clearly it is changing. If it weren't changing, if it weren't seeing the success that this book refers to and what I have just spoken about, then you wouldn't see this kind of resistance from the old elite who are in their echo chambers, who are not connected to the rest of the country and resisting this change. So yes, the narrative setting is indeed changing, reflecting a modern, forward-looking India. Now, to the other aspect of your question, and I will link this to another question you asked Smriti Irani ji, has to do with democracy. Now, this is true not just of India, but around the world as well. For at least 2 decades, there's been this tussle in academia and policy circles about the Beijing consensus versus the Washington consensus. Now, for the last 250 years, modern democracies have overcome all kinds of challenges, including wars, including economic rivalry with non-democracies, and including the challenges of narrative setting by the former Soviet Union and so on and so forth. But today there is a new narrative that is, at least has taken part hold, that democracy where one person, one vote, one country is under challenge, that unless you have some kind of a guided democracy, unless you have some kind of a state capitalism as we are seeing in China, it cannot compete. Now, is that narrative over? It's not, because that challenge is fully on. And that challenge is on today in India as well, because when true democracy asserts itself, when the, if I may say, the unwashed masses around the country are asserting that they want to see a confident new India that cherishes its heritage and is willing to take that forward in a modern version, then there is resistance to it. So this is a narrative which is still very much in play and has not settled down on the issue of whether democracies can deal with this. And as the world's largest democracy, India is not just the world's largest democracy, it's the largest democracy that has ever existed in the history of humankind, faces up to this and is very actively and successfully changing this narrative. I think we will play a role not just in changing the Indian narrative, but the narrative about democracies around the world as well.
So let me ask you a quick question and a quick reply on this, because I want to move to Mr. Joshi and Sanjeev, who has joined us. So welcome, Sanjeev. I want to ask you a quick question. We, as an elite, are troubled, as you suggest, by the success of the new narrative that is clearly emerging. Then why is it that, as Mr. Vikram Sood suggests, we continue to seek affirmation from them and confirmation from them and in some sense their approval for the narratives we write? I think that's something that he suggests in his book, that we continue to want to be featured in the Washington Post and New York Times and all these other old mediums of the old world in some ways. How do you reconcile the two?
When there has been a century and a half of inculcating that what we had and what we have is inferior, what they brought to us is somehow superior and we must accept that, then it takes more than one generation of trying to change the narrative to change it. Now, I'll give this an example. You are asking a policy question. Let me put this in a simplistic context of why do fairness creams still do well in India? Why is it that we see lighter skin as somehow being superior? Now, this is a simplistic example of exactly what is happening on the policy front, that because of that inculcation of a century and a half, there are still lingering effects, whether it is on selling fairness creams or whether it is in promoting our new narrative. But it's changing. As a new generation of people come up, as people like the minister and other panelists here and others speak about the Indian narrative with much more confidence, not requiring validation from the external world, it will change in the coming generation.
Thank you, Mr. Panda. Mr. Joshi, there's a very interesting question on the screen It says that, can you elaborate on the role of American universities and the education system? Let me take a little bit of liberty and add think tanks to it. Since you're the chairman of the Observer Research Foundation, let me ask you, what is the role of universities, think tanks, and the knowledge networks, and what is the role they played in building the US narrative in the 20th century? How do you respond to the risk of deracinated positions taken by many holding powerful positions in these institutions and who are educated in the West but running institutions in the East, in India, in other parts of Asia? So there are two questions here: the role, and what do you do when they come and run your institutions?
Samir, actually, Mr. Sood has mentioned in his book, and very, very aptly, both in this book as well as in his previous book, the role played by academicians, the role played by think tanks in constructing the narratives. And narratives are essentially exercises in the overreach of power. Narratives are what? Narratives are nothing else but explanations designed to create an order in a very, very disordered world, and create an order. That is where his whole thesis about where does narrative become is fact, where it is fiction, where it is just perception comes into play. So narratives are that way, they're trying to create a circle around certain facts, tying those facts into a storyline which projects the greatness of a nation, which projects the greatness of an institution, which projects the greatness of any political group. So that is fundamentally what narratives are doing. And in this book, he very aptly brings out how academia, certain American institutions have played a role in furthering the US narrative of an invincible power that could not be defeated. The fact is that, yes, today that narrative lies in shambles. It's been broken because it got defeated by a plain and simple virus. So facts do break in. The whole thing about narratives is that a narrative, as long as it is consistent, as long as it is coherent, does carry dominion within it. It does carry that power projection within it. But will a narrative remain unchallenged? Will there be other voices, counter narratives, which will start threatening that narrative? And you spoke about polarization, which is a very apt point. Polarization essentially means when the narrative starts breaking down. When the narrative starts getting challenged from within a country, you see a polarized country. And that is fundamentally what you've been seeing across the world. So yes, academicians, think tanks, all do play a fundamental role. As far as the role of deracinated individuals, trying to seed certain narratives, become party to those narratives, yes, they are joining the flow. A narrative has so much power. When a narrative carries power, it is like a raging river. It carries everything along it. Everyone starts believing. That is fundamentally what happened to the India story, which Mr. Sood speaks about. Why we started believing that we are a nation of snake charmers, because that is the force of the narrative, the number of institutions trying to create it, the number of people feeding into it. So that, yes, creates a certain force. It's like a swelling river, but there are counters which develop, and in any country, in any nation, this is bound to happen. And we see that happening in India. That has been happening in India for some time. As a nation starts progressing, as a nation starts growing, as a nation starts becoming confident of its own stories. And why should India not be confident of its own story? See, the narratives are discussed as in postmodern thought as instruments of power. But the fact is, go back, forget postmodern thought. The whole Indian ethos centrally recognizes, if you start looking at Indian culture, it recognizes the role of the narrator. Whether you look at the Mahabharata, or whether you look at the Katha Sagar, that fictional saga where every story ever written in the world, every story ever to be written in the world is all contained in that ocean of stories, the Katha Sagar, of which today only parts really remain. But the fact is that if you start looking at those are all stories within stories, and in all those stories, there is always that one narrator creating that narrative. So the fact that this is a matter of perception, that this is a matter of control, is fundamental to the idea of narratives. And that, I think, is the beauty of Mr. Vikram Sood's book. He brings it out very well. It is a multi-layered book, and that is what I like about it. It's a multi-layered book. It is not simply about nations creating narratives. It is about institutions within nations creating narratives, sometimes creating counter-narratives. And yes, democracy is also part of this process.
Let me quickly move to Mr. Sood and then to Ms. Irani on this particular point. There's an audience question from one of your colleagues, Mr. Sood, Sanjeev Tripathi, and he speaks about the Pakistani effort and the Pakistani attempt to build a narrative and convert the J&K issue into a human rights problem. I think that's something that you have dealt with in your work here, and Sanjeev wants your comments on the need to counter this. And he says, his question implicitly asks you that where is it that we have, in a sense, not done enough to counter this Pakistani attempt to paint this as a human rights issue?
It is true that the Pakistanis were always very aggressive about how they portrayed Kashmir, and the narrative was that they are the victims and the Kashmiris are victims. But this kind of a thing happens in a particular milieu in the world. Remember, the Pakistani narrative gained momentum after the Afghan war, after the Mujahideen had been there and Russia, Soviet Union had been defeated. You had these Mujahideen to spare, or the tribals to spare, or the ethos to spare. And then you had, then we made our own mistakes in Kashmir. And the situation led to what it became in the 90s. Now, those were the days of the immediate Cold War, the 90s. And USA had won. They said it was the New World Order. They owed Pakistan something for what it had done. So they were not going to listen to our version of stories. They would go with the Pakistani stories. Besides, after the Cold War ended, as it were, you had this United States found, or the West found, they had no enemy. They had no reason to interfere elsewhere. So human rights actually became a very, very fine issue to dabble in other people's affairs. You would recall how the OIC would want to raise the issue of Kashmir in their sessions and so on and so forth. We were always defending, we were always reacting, we were never proactive in the 90s. And the Pakistan version carried on. Unless, as I say in my book, unless you act first, unless you do it quickly and repeated, the narrative does not get built.
So can I ask you a follow-up? Can I ask you a follow-up? You had a disruption in 2001 with the 9/11 incidents, and there was a whole new appreciation of the war on terror. You had the Mr. Vajpayee government who forged strong ties with the US. You had an opportunity to change the narrative on terror within your borders as well. Do you think India invested enough in building that?
No. At that time also, the war on terror was not a global war on terror. The war on terror was only about Afghanistan and America and Iraq. Kashmir was not important. If you remember what George Bush said in that speech, that we will go after all terrorists who have a global reach. Which meant not Lashkar-e-Taiba, which was local, or Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is local. It meant Al-Qaeda, it meant the Iranians, and so on and so forth. So we were never part of the game.
And we did not do enough ourselves to be able to counter.
We did not. I mean, look, 2008 happened, and what did we do? We didn't even show our anger on Pakistan adequately enough. And then we later on went and said Pakistan is also a victim of terror. Now, how do you build a narrative? What do you tell the others? But they say you are also a victim, they're also a victim, so what's your problem, man? So we are not consistent in what we want to seek. Are we not forceful enough?
Sanjeev, welcome back. I missed you in the last round. I wanted to ask you a question that you are not only the principal economic advisor, but you are better known as a storyteller. You have written marvelous books, some of which we have released at ORF as well, and had you over at the institution. You have told stories of globalization, told stories of India's international engagement. Let me ask you a forward-looking question. What is the story we should be telling now? 20 years from now, if someone was to say that Sanjeev Sanyal built the story of India, what would that story look like? As a storyteller, what should we be focusing on in the future?
Let me start by apologizing for being first late and then having some terrible IT problems, so I keep dropping off. So bear with me. But let me begin, of course, by congratulating Mr. Sood for an excellent book on a topic which is very, very dear to my heart and very timely as well, about how to construct narratives. Now, of course, one part of the narrative building is about narrative building about yourself. And some of that is about writing your own history. As the old African proverb goes, until the lions have their own storytellers, the history of the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So we need to write our own stories, and of course the obvious thing to start with is by revisiting and writing our own history. I have attempted in my way to contribute to that, but hopefully we will finally begin to get it into our textbooks and other things. But anyway, the good news is this is at least a matter of debate. So at some point, hopefully, we will write our own history and it will go into the textbooks. But your question really relates to what we should do about the storytelling going forward. And here I think we have not even started a real debate. I'm glad that Mr. Sood does bring up some interesting thing here, which is that you can criticize other narratives as much as you want. But until and unless you have an alternative narrative, you cannot replace the old narrative. A critique of an old narrative does not replace the old narrative. Only a new narrative replaces the old narrative. This is important because that comes through very clearly in Mr. Sood's book. So I think here something we need to do is very important, which is that we need to also deconstruct the West. Now let me explain what I mean. You see, when there is an election, say in India, then Washington Post has a view, Financial Times has a view, the New York Times has a view, BBC has a view on elections and what should happen in India. When we look at the view of what is happening in the West, we are also, however, debating the New York Times view, the Washington Post view, and BBC's view. If you read our newspapers, you will see basically what they do is they either get foreign writers to write about the US elections, or they'll take Reuters or Bloomberg and put it in. I very rarely will see an Indian writer deconstructing their elections. Or even if they do it, they will do it in the very narrow perspective that how does Biden or Trump's getting elected impacts India? Why shouldn't we think about the wider issue? For example, Kaplan can write about monsoon and the Indian Ocean world. Why shouldn't Indians write about the Atlantic and about the future of the Atlantic? But somehow we never do that. And with the one exception maybe of Vion, which does it to some extent, none of our newspapers, magazines, TV channels deconstruct the rest of the world. And until we have a narrative about the other chap, we are not going to be able to really engage with them. This is a very important point. We haven't even begun to think about it. So while we have finally been about ourselves, or at least we are debating about the need to have a narrative about ourselves, the fact that India also needs a narrative about the rest of the world and needs to propagate it, that part hasn't even started.
So I think what you are suggesting is go back to the Levinasian theory, Levinas's theory that it's the other who defines the self, and unless you start engaging with the other in a particular manner, you are unable to discover who you are. So, and of course, we have to then go to the ethical dimensions. I'll come to that at a different debate in a different day. But let me ask all of you the final question I want to ask. And there are at least three audience members who have posed this in different ways, from Manu Sharma to Mr. Pathak in the very beginning of this event, and a few others. I think the question is as follows. Narratives are based on national consensus. I would argue the success of American narratives was based on the fact that whether you were Democrat or Republic, there was at least 9 out of 10 items that both agreed to. So national consensus is one of the driving elements of narrative building. Second, the government, which is the state, enlists citizens and non-state actors in this enterprise of narrative building. One of the questions suggests that India shields the narrative building process from its citizens, and the stories that the citizens tell are very different from the story of the state. So there is an incoherence between the state and the non-state in India. And the third part of this question is that where is the economic and political imperative that we have agreed to as a country. So every narrative of power has politics embedded and an economic outcome needed. Does India have a political and economic outcome that it has agreed to, around which these big stories, like Mr. Joshi mentioned, can we circle the wagons when we don't know where the circle should be? And in that sense, the story and the prognosis of India being able to be a storyteller, a nation telling a story, including all its arms, including a direction that most have agreed to, through mediums that are able to amplify the core message. Let me start with the Minister and end with Mr. Sood. Minister Irani, can I turn to you first?
Thank you, Samir. I think that there are 2-3 challenges to the question that you pose. There are different kinds of narratives that we need to engage with as a nation. One, of course, the diplomatic and the financial narrative that the polity wants to project to the world. The second is a popular narrative in which, as Mr. Sood's book reflects on, the non-state actor. And if you look at how the popular narrative about India was developed around the world, I'll just give you a small example. We had, while Mr. Sood laments about the fact that we were projected as a country of snake charmers, we did have Indians make pieces of art and cinema which actually built on that international narrative that was thrust upon us. So even the so-called non-state actors within our country did not want to differ from that international narrative that was woven about India. The second issue is that, is it fairly a big challenge today, given again, like I said, the ample opportunity technology presents to deconstruct narrative, to build a new narrative that sustains over a longer period of time? And the narratives that we've been speaking of till now are narratives for whom the seeds were sown decades ago. And as Mr. Sood rightly says, that they've been repeatedly said and they've become a part of very much public conscience. How difficult it is to build then a new narrative, given that Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp is available to break down and deconstruct it as nations do so desire or deem fit. The third aspect is, I think, which a question that you posed to Jay Panda is about why do we seek approval of, let's say, the Washington Times or the Financial Times with regards to narratives that are built about India. I think that there is a recognition that you cannot leave a platform you cannot leave a platform where you do not counter a false narrative. I think that those times have now gone in India where you say, अच्छा किसी ने लिख दिया है तो भूल जाओ, हम Times of India में अपनी opinion लिख देंगे. I think you have to take the battle at times to places where they're being fought, even if it's internationally. I also feel that, looking at what Sanjeev has said, it is today difficult for Indian media enterprises to write about, let's say, as Sanjeev said, why not write about the Atlantic? Because you don't have those kind of consumers within the Indian public for those pieces of writings or for those news items. And given the finances of media enterprises, that is why you do not have enough space in, let's say, television news channels, or for that matter, newspapers about the world perspective on some international issues. So I think that ultimately, if I was to be brutally honest, it is not possible to have a consensus on political, financial, diplomatic narratives and public narratives. Because I think the beauty of technology is such that it will be countered the minute that narrative is presented to public at large. But I think that I would leave today this conversation with a very interesting what if that Vikram Sood's book leaves us with. You threw a question about Pakistan to Mr. Sood. And I think the narrative that Pakistan has spun about the Kashmir story, or for that matter, the India story, the seeds were sown decades ago. I mean, Mr. Sood's book actually highlights who was the first ambassador to the US from India vis-a-vis Pakistan. And that is how the whole ball got rolling. But the interesting what ifs that I find in his book is about Jinnah. That Jinnah who declared on the 16th of August 1946 the direct action day and invited war upon India if his demands were not met, was a Jinnah who the British knew was sick in January 1946, and I'm subject to correction by Mr. Sood. So imagine what if this part of history became a part of our textbooks or became a part of popular debate. What if the British knew that Jinnah was dying? Would they not then call his bluff? What if the Indian polity then knew that Jinnah was dying? Why did they not resist his endeavors to partition India? And I think that what if today is a very strong part of popular narrative. And that is why, Samir, you see this whole clash of ideas, which many people say is a bit distasteful. How dare you ask what if? And I think that is what the book does. It leaves you with the what if. What if we had taken on these issues head on when we were just breathing life into a democracy? Would our narrative have been different today? And I truly believe it would have been. And as I leave you, I again quote from what Mr. Sood has written in the last chapter, quoting Milind Kundra: the first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memories, destroy its books, its cultures, its history. What if the India story was not destroyed, but spoken as it was, a civilizational heritage that the world was proud of?
Thank you, ma'am. Let me turn to Mr. Jai Panda for your thoughts on this very vast question.
So your question was, do we have an agreement on the political, economic, and related issues on which our narrative has to be set? The short answer is absolutely yes. And let me explain. The word consensus often gets conflated with unanimity. Now, of course, with 1.3 billion people, we will not have unanimity. But in the world's largest democracy, when we have the people's endorsement through the legitimate means of having single party majority in the parliament after 30 years, does it not mean an agreement of the direction with which the leader of this plurality is leading us? Is it not reflected in the popularity of the Prime Minister, for instance, on any of the crucial issues, whether it is on how do we have given a response to Pakistan on their saber rattling using the nuclear shield, misusing the nuclear shield, and we have reset the normal. Or whether it comes to dealing with our challenges on the LAC with China, whether it comes to taking very, very bold decisions which had been agreed to but had been pending for decades, whether politically, such as 370, or CAA, or economically. Last word I want to say on this is, there is still a resistance from the old elite, such as on the Farm Bill. They completely were hypocrites in going against their own established earlier position. I'm talking about certain opposition leaders and opposition parties. And yet they got some play in the remnants of the old elite Lutyens media that was not harsh enough with them in asking how could they square with this hypocrisy. So that's why there is some lingering effect. But the answer to your question is, we clearly do have that agreement on the narrative of which way India should be heading.
But you would surely agree that having political outcomes which allow someone to lead the system of governance is not perhaps equal to coherence of storytelling. And I think that was my larger question, that while you may have the political majority to lead the country towards a certain direction, the India story is still fragmented. And can we build a more consensual framework there? And that was the point I was trying to raise.
Well, let me give you a quick answer. The answer is narratives don't change like that with the snap of a finger. Now, if you have coherence in the political direction that we want to go, if that political coherence gives the ability to the leadership to take these bold economic directions, and only a few resisting elites, but not the masses opposing it, then you already have the crux of what is needed for that narrative setting. I think narrative setting doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. Any of the examples that have been given in Mr. Sood's book, or we have experienced in the discussion today, those narratives were not built overnight. But we certainly have the groundwork done for changing of the Indian narrative, but there is work left. There is work in progress.
I think, Samir, we also indulge in a lot of self-flagellation when we talk about what the India story is. The India story has been, at least for the last, and I have said this repeatedly time and time again, has been fairly consistent since the 1990s. There have been disruptions, there have been breakages in it, there have been political parties which have not delivered on it consistently because of internal contradictions, internal these things. But the fact is that the India story of a country growing, of a large democracy, a vibrant democracy with a vibrant youth moving forward, which is going to be the promise of the future, that story had and still has a certain consistency. And it's a good idea to build upon it, beyond the political fragmentation which is obvious in any democracy. That political fragmentation, yes, is part and parcel of democracy, of nation building. Because India, essentially, the big difference is India is a democracy. India will remain a democracy. You will not get the kind, and you should not get the kind of consensus that you see in the China story emerging out of India, because to do that, you are destroying the very essence of the nation. So there is an India story. The point is the story needs to be told well. It needs to be told again and again to the world. I do not think we should be diffident about it.
Sanjeev, let me throw a twist to you. You have written long books, but you have also written short tales. You have also put out a collection of short stories. Do you think the future narrative in a world where everyone has attention deficit disorder, where we can only read tweets and not tales, do you think India's narrative will have multiple short segments appealing to different constituencies through different mediums? Is it time to reimagine narrative building in the 21st century? The idea of narrative itself has to be reimagined.
So actually you have raised a very, very interesting question. So the question is, one, all the discussion we had is about what kind of narrative, not so much about how we tell it. So I think what you are raising is how do we tell the narrative? And I think most of the conversation, and I would say even the one that is there in Mr. Sood's book, is really about the non-fiction narrative. In the sense, this is about our image as it is clearly projected, as in consciously projected, or writing the history books, whoever does it, whether I do it or the NCERT does it, and so on and so forth. However, a lot of the narrative building happens subconsciously, in fact through popular culture. So this is actually something that we do not take into account at all, even though we respond to it in many ways in tweets, etc. I mean, just this morning, I sort of wrote against HBO India, simply categorizing two Hindu sects as somehow being scary, and just left it out there without really even thinking about it. I don't think they were going out of their way to construct it. They were just going along with popular culture characterization of Aghoris and other Hindu cults as being somehow scary. Now, this is an important second order issue that we also need to think about, because in some ways we talk about Indian soft power in terms of Bollywood and so on, but in fact much of that soft power is completely colonized in multiple different ways. There is very little difference, for example, between Indiana Jones's characterization of Hindu gods and the one that you very often get in Bollywood. So this is an important part of thinking about the wider narrative building. As I said, the good news is, as much as self-flagellation we may do, at least we have become conscious of this issue. Why we have been conscious is maybe part of it is just the result of economic growth and feeling richer, etc. Social media has played a very big role in getting these other narratives going. And yes, the political loss of the old elite and its sort of partial replacement has also meant that new voices have come. But even now, there is a serious storytellers, if I may call them that. And those storytellers don't only have to be in non-fiction, they have to be in the wider popular culture. And that is weak. And somehow asking for new storytellers is resisted quite fiercely in the system. And you can see that happening in Bollywood, irrespective of this current controversy. There is a certain elite that sticks around there and regulates it. I myself, as a writer, can tell you, when I deal with publishers, I have to regularly, even though I am a reasonably well-established writer, I have to push back against editors who continuously edit me in a particularly tilted way. I mean, for example, they'll remove the word Hinduism and replace it with Brahmanism throughout all my writings. I have to go back and change them all the time. Recently, there was this whole issue about Bloomsbury. They were willing to publish a certain kind of book, but wouldn't publish another kind of book, and there was a big controversy over it. They finally, the book was withdrawn and being republished by somebody else. But I'm just telling you this whole tilted area. So never mind think tanks, academia, newspaper op-eds. There is a vast world of popular culture that is still very tilted. Not because there isn't demand for alternative narratives. When somebody writes them, they sell very well. I mean, Amish writes mythological fiction. He was really discouraged when he tried to write them, and when he managed to get it, it sold like crazy. So I think there is demand there. I think there is simply, we are not paying enough attention to this whole world, and I think the time has come to begin to populate these spaces as well.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Mr. Sood, the final word to you. I think you have, in many ways in the book, highlighted the importance of Hollywood and popular culture in the American attempt to create a favorable global ecosystem. Looking ahead and creating about your last nearly 5 decades of study in this particular area, what do you think could be, as Gautam Chikramane says, asks in his question to you, that what could be a few things we should be focusing on as we move towards hopefully a $5 and then a $10 trillion economy? This is Gautam Chikramane for you. So this is the last question and the last word for you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Chikramane asks difficult questions, always. But he's still a friend. The thing is, narratives cannot be built in a day, as Jay Panda just said. And as Sanjay also mentioned, narratives are not something that you do in isolated groups. It's a national effort. It has a corporate entity to it. And in America, the major institutions are so well honed with the establishment that they are the second, they are the real State Department at times. Mm-hmm. The CFR is known as the Wall Street think tank. So they are meshed in together. We have not reached that stage. We are working in silos. We want to be very jealous about somebody else taking my turf away. And there were attempts when I was working that you have your cyber operations controlled by the MHA. I mean, this is absurd. It can't function with you telling them what the report you made and how you've been publishing it, where it's been published, etc., etc. So those things don't work. Nor will a system like the question was that there should be a national consensus before we get a national narrative. You'll never get it. In the West, the narrative was essentially built by the rich and powerful. They handed it down to the rest. And that became, after all, former US presidents in the 18th century, 19th century, Thomas Jefferson and Adams and all, they were all slave owners. So was Robert Peel in England. He traded in slaves. So did the CEO of the East India Company, single S. He was the CEO for trading slave labor to USA. But that is all done by them. Nobody talks about it now. Black Lives Matter is a new thing. It will probably die off soon. I don't know. Narratives have to come from, I think there has to be a consensus, but it has to come down from somewhere. It has to be sourced upstream. It cannot come from down up. And for building a $5 trillion economy, I think all bets are off till you have COVID out of the way. And but there are positive stories that I can see that are coming out of India, and we're not able to highlight them. We don't want to do it. Some section maybe don't want to highlight it because good news is no news, and everything that is bad is to be pinned on one person in India these days. So we're not likely to get a very positive response from within ourselves. If we don't get it at home, how do we get it abroad? Unless we sing a good tune at home, who's going to listen to us outside? And that is our problem. Thank you very much, everybody who's been here today. Anyway, Samir, over to you.
Those are very wise words from one of India's foremost super spies, intellectual, academic, and a thought leader. Sing the right tune at home so that others can hear you clearly. I think that's something which should be an India project in the coming days. Let me first thank the Honorable Minister Smriti Irani for joining us. Ma'am, wishing you speedy recovery. Hope you get well soon. And thank you for your interventions. We are touched and honored that you could be here on this very special occasion. Thank you.
Congratulations, Mr. Sood.
Thank you, Mr. Jay Panda, for being with us this evening. Sanjeev, we will work on your tech game. We need to get it up to speed. And thank you, Mr. Joshi, for joining us from across the border from Noida. So I hope you enjoyed this very interesting conversation. It will be on our YouTube and various social media handles soon, so you can revisit parts of it that interest you. And thank you, Swati, for your effort to make this book happen. And thank you for making those very warm opening remarks. Thank you, Mr. Sood, for always being there.